What has been the Democratic mantra for the Trump era? I mean, the words of Nancy Pelosi, all roads lead to Putin. That's literally what they've talked about, and it's their official mantra. That's what they even say, all roads lead to Putin. And so what will be the impact of that mantra and that fixation on the election?
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, and I'm joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal, and we're also speaking today with our colleague from the Gray Zone, Aaron Maté, the buzzsaw. Isn't that what they call you, Aaron? The Russiagate buzzsaw.
That's what they call me.
So today,
that's what they call me.
You know, we have the guru on to talk about the latest in the Russiagate conspiracy. It just won't die. It's this zombie conspiracy, and we're also going to talk about the Democratic National Convention that's going on right now. It's a virtual convention. It was going to be in Milwaukee, but because of the coronavirus pandemic, it's happening all online. And it's really, I mean, it's incredible. They brought out so many neoconservatives. There are a bunch of Republicans speaking. And I think one of the things, so we're going to start this episode just reflecting on the state of the Democratic Party, what the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, says about the right-wing politics of this party, and especially in this moment of the new Cold War. That's an issue that here at Moderate Rebels we talk about a lot, and at the Gray Zone, a lot of our work is dedicated to exposing the new propaganda in this Cold War against not just Russia, but also China. And just, I mean, I'm curious what your guys' kind of cursory responses to the DNC going on, because I've only checked out some of the speeches here and there. I mean, it's ungodly boring, but even aside from how boring it is, it's so depressing seeing yet another like weapons industry funded drone talking about how our national security is at stake and how Trump is destroying the image of the U.S. around the globe. I mean, what do you guys think?
Well, since Aaron's our special guest and he was getting screamed at by Jimmy Dore because he's basically, you're a Biden proxy. You're a Biden, a Biden influencer or what? You're like the Sean King of Biden. No, I'm joking. But Jimmy Dore was screaming at you over Biden. So, and then at the same time, I think you said you watched 3 minutes of the convention and then you went and colluded with Putin or something. You disappeared. So what are your thoughts before I say anything?
Well, look, I mean, my argument with Jimmy was just, I have nothing positive to say about Biden and the people around him. Nothing, literally nothing. Nothing positive to say about Kamala Harris. I just think the people around Trump are even worse and will cause even more suffering and death on the world. That's my prediction of what a Trump presidency would be versus a Biden one. And so for that reason, I think Trump should be defeated. But, looking at this convention is an example why there's just nothing for progressives here. It's ridiculous. They have Colin Powell speaking, the public salesperson for the Iraq War, speaking on behalf of one of the top Democratic salespersons of the Iraq War, Joe Biden. They have this tribute video to John McCain, one of the biggest warmongers of the Senate in the last, in the modern age. And where's the discussion of any issue that really impacts people's lives? It's totally off the table. So from what I've caught of this convention, it's as depressing as ever. It's as depressing as ever.
It's more depressing than ever, I would say. Although it's less insidious, and I think there's something positive about that. First of all, I'll make 2 points here. One is sort of a historical point, which is that this convention and the process that saw Bernie getting basically kicked in the face and dragged along into the convention where he becomes this kind of surrogate for Biden, and the left-wing movement that he brought in and all the excited young people just are, becoming demoralized by Bernie's willingness to play this game. This might seem really demoralizing to them and upsetting, but it follows a historical process within the Democratic Party. It's a very particular process to the post-Cold War era where after World War II, the New Deal was instituted because of fears of a communist revolution in the United States. There was mobilization during the Great Depression, communist mobilization. There was a resurgence after the Palmer raids of real socialist activity, and the New Deal was necessary in order to first to literally save the country from the economic royalists who FDR presented as his enemy, and from the communists who he feared and who, many liberals around him, classical liberals, feared. So, you had a kind of Keynesian New Deal. And the Democratic Party always saw that it had these two, that it was kind of caught in in sort of a pincher-like situation between the threat of communism, and it was, the Democratic Party was filled with these hardcore anti-communists, the Americans for Democratic Action. They came out of the 60s as anti-communists who supported the Vietnam War and this quote-unquote muscular foreign policy, but they also opposed the kind of unfettered libertarian corporate economics of the Republican Party. And so they provided some kind of alternative to just the neoliberal model. But after the Soviet Union collapsed and the whole threat of socialism in the United States was crushed, those fears were completely alleviated and obliterated, and the Democratic Party was free to bond with Wall Street and bring in the policies that we saw during the Clinton and Gore era. And, Al Gore often gets kind of left out here, but he was a very right-wing senator from Tennessee who was pro-war, pro-death penalty. Bill Clinton was a Southern Democrat. They were selected for a reason. And the DNC came under the influence of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council. This is 1992, with the U.S. at its unipolar, hegemonic height. They could do whatever they wanted. And so what they proceeded to do was end welfare as we know it, pass NAFTA, shipping all the blue-collar jobs away, providing very little retraining for those blue-collar Rust Belt communities. And you saw this program continue through the first Bush administration started it. It continued through the second Bush administration. And then we get to the Obama era. The Obama era is, it begins when? The financial crash. The chickens are beginning to come home to roost with neoliberal economics. The abandonment of the New Deal and LBJ's Great Society. And people have some kind of faith in Obama, but I remember being at Hyde Park in Chicago for what was Obama's victory celebration. And Hyde Park was filled with people of all walks of life, something I've never seen before, celebrating in a way I've never seen Americans celebrate the election of an American president. And I saw, black youth coming out into the street, standing in the middle of the street, chanting spontaneously, "We love America." And I mean, this just what else could you ask for in terms of American soft power? But I knew what Obama was. I'd been around the nation at that time, and I was paying really close attention, but I wasn't saying anything partly because everyone at the nation just worshipped Obama. They believed he was going to end the wars. They believed he was going to reverse this neoliberal process. They basically didn't even think that. They just worshipped him in a sort of messianic way. And I think partly they loved the historicity of it, that he was the first black president. I remember there was this moment on a Nation cruise I heard about where Eric Alterman said, the Nation writer, who is this, really, we don't have to say anything about him, but just sort of a cartoon of a liberal, like in their 50s or 60s. And he said, Obama, he's not Jesse Jackson. He's not scary. And basically that's what a lot of people thought. But I knew that Obama had surrounded himself with these neoliberal figures who were basically the next wave of the DLC, that he was going to be the most insidious, perfect person for Wall Street and the war state. And I remember standing there in the middle of Hyde Park and feeling completely just demoralized and upset. Everyone there wanted to cry tears of joy. I was ready to cry tears of sorrow because I knew that he was going to take all the hopes of all these people that were surrounding me, all this human potential, and just completely crush it. And he proceeded to do so by bailing out the banksters. So that was, I think, a really seminal moment that helped lead us to today, where Obama's vice president, Joe Biden, and we know about his record, is going to receive his coronation, and everyone expects him to be the next president. And I think a lot of this has to do with the failure of any force within the left in the U.S. to challenge Obama.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I don't want to get into like a debate about whether or not people should support Biden. I mean, there's 8,000 debates about that. I mean, I personally am never going to cast a vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but I don't want to get into that. I want to focus more on what's happened, to understand what the Democratic Party is doing here, to understand what the maneuver is. And there was one moment, and I should say that today is the 19th, Wednesday. So tomorrow, Thursday, the 20th of August, is the last day of the DNC. So we've gone through over half of it now. And there was a speech that was absolutely incredible that I think, just reflects the orientation of where the Democratic Party is going. And people who follow this show probably know that there's this group, the Lincoln Project, which is all of these neoconservative Republicans, never Trump Republicans, many of whom worked in the George W. Bush campaign and were strong supporters, even architects of the Iraq War. And another Republican who was invited to speak at the DNC was John Kasich, which is incredible. This is an Ohio Republican from a purple state. And what's incredible is that in the 2016 election, he was a Republican presidential candidate. Of course, he's an anti-Trump Republican, and he gave a speech. And here I have up, for those watching, the New York Post published an article. Of course, the New York Post is a right-leaning tabloid in New York, and they were trumpeting this speech in which he said, quote, "Respectful Joe Biden won't turn sharp left." And Kasich was imploring other so-called moderate Republicans to support Biden because he said he's not going to turn sharp left. And he said, quote, "We're being taken down the wrong road by a president who is pitting one against each other." He's talking about Trump, of course. So Republicans need to unite behind Joe Biden because he's basically a Republican. So, I mean, it's so incredible that the Democratic Party bent over backward to bring on not only Republicans, but people who were Republican presidential candidates in the last election. And they're going out on stage, well, the virtual stage, and saying, don't worry, they're not going to move to the left.
I just wanted to say, I remember, Max, when you were warning people about Obama, because I was one of the people who kind of like bought into it a little bit because he was opposed to Hillary Clinton. I figured that there might be some room for being a genuine alternative there to Hillary, when really he just became the Clinton administration reincarnated. And I remember you warning everybody, a group of leftists, we went out and had drinks sometime during that campaign, and you told a group of leftists that Obama was basically going to be a sellout. And I remember you offending even some people, but you were the first person, I think, that I recall hearing to sound the alarm bells about it. Glenn Ford also did a Black Agenda report, but it's an example of how where the voices of dissent that prove to be accurate are often just very minor when the initial phase is happening. And
well, that just to clarify, that was the full extent of my dissent. Like, I didn't make it public at that time.
Yeah,
I can talk about why, but
yeah. Yeah, well,
I wasn't brave enough to speak up, except going out for drinks with all these nation people, and like I remember the scene broke up pretty quickly after that.
But what I also want to say is that just in terms of having nothing, the one positive thing actually I think I can say about Biden is that he doesn't have the political skills that Obama does, and I don't think he'll be able to dupe people into staying on the sidelines and convince people that he's doing something lofty when really he's doing the same old thing, which is what, of course, he will try to do. Because he can't speak very well, he doesn't have it all there, and he's just not nearly as gifted a politician as Obama was, that I don't think he'll have that nullifying effect that Obama did. At least that's my hope if he is elected.
Yeah, and what's incredible is we just saw a poll, and for those watching, I just got this up here, and it shows that 56% of people who say they're going to vote for Biden say they're voting him because he's not Donald Trump. Over half of people who are going to vote for Biden, the only reason they support him is because he's not Trump. That's an incredible indictment, not only of Biden, but of this farce that it's called American democracy, where, I mean, that was probably true for the 2016 election, where a large percentage of people who voted for Clinton or for Trump were voting against the other candidate. But here we have incontrovertible proof that over half of people voting for him don't even care about him. It's hard not to be totally cynical, but when it comes to domestic U.S. politics, I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm pretty cynical about the possibility of real change.
I've gone through a process myself where I really came out of, party politics and came out of Washington, and, it's something I understand really well, and I covered campaigns. This is the first convention I haven't been at since 2004. No, sorry, since 2000. I've been at every convention either outside protesting in 2000 because I was just disgusted with, Lieberman Gore, like you're picking Joe Lieberman. So I wound up getting tear gassed in Los Angeles where I was living at the time. And then, 2004 through 2012, I covered the conventions. 2016, I was part of the People's Convention. I spoke on a panel with a member of Berta Cáceres' Copine. Rania Kalik was, moderating the panel, and we had Juan Gonzalez from Democracy Now! Remember that show? And, this, I can't be there. No one can be there. No one can be there protesting. But I really, there was a point when I wanted the Democratic Party to be a vehicle for change. And you just go through a process in your life where you get to a point, and at the very least, you can come to the conclusion that the party is it's become illegitimate from a progressive point of view. And I went, going back to the 90s with the strategy of catering to suburban soccer moms. This was the Democratic Leadership Council's strategy, moving into these swing districts. And they thought this would help build a permanent democratic America, moving into the moderate Republican districts. That's the strategy that Biden and his people are repurposing by bringing all these so-called moderate Republicans, including Kasich, who isn't even moderate. Like when you think about a moderate Republican, you think about people like Nancy Kassenbaum from Kansas or Tom Keene from New Jersey, who at least will allow people to have abortions while they're cutting taxes for the rich. That John Kasich wouldn't do that. He's someone who was like a favorite of the Christian right. So they're just taking any Republican they can.
Well, it's incredible because it's, we talk about moderate rebels. It's the name of the show, but like, this is like the domestic equivalent, right? Because whenever the US wants to overthrow a foreign government, they always support these extremist forces, and they're like, oh, they're moderate rebels. So here we have pretty extreme right-wing Republicans who are now the moderate rebels.
Well, yeah, I mean, what we're witnessing, but they're just the establishment. And what we're witnessing, and I think a lot of people are in denial about this, a lot of people who self-identify as progressives, and the people who still believe that Bernie Sanders is going to be able to put substantial pressure on Biden and Harris after they are inaugurated, is that we are witnessing a political realignment, which really is a consolidation of a declining empire and its political future. And there aren't two parties in the US. The only reason there are two parties is because of our anti-democratic electoral system. In reality, there are three parties, maybe four parties, but there are three parties. And the one central party that sees itself as the hegemonic party and sees Trump as a rogue outrider who won by a fluke is the party we're seeing at the Democratic National Convention. It's the establishment. It's what Trump constantly refers to as the deep state. But it's people who range from Kasich to Biden and Harris, but nowhere further to the left. That's why it's just so pathetic that Bernie's being brought along with it, because there's no place in there for him or his principled supporters. And that's the third party. The real third party is the kind of populist left, the young people who are deeply in debt, people of color who are being taken for granted by the Democratic Party and are sick of being taken for granted, the people who are left out of the strategy that was ratified in the 1990s by the Democratic Leadership Council, but have always been brought back in and sheepdogged back into the party. That's the real third party, and they're not represented by any party. They don't have anyone to vote for in this electoral system. If they try to vote for someone like Ralph Nader or Jill Stein, then they're voting for a Russian asset, and there's nowhere for them to go. And that's where I think the frustration in this discussion is coming from, and why all three of us are responding in sort of a, I wouldn't call it a cynical way, but at least with outrage to the situation we find ourselves in, where it's not that our votes don't count, our voices don't count in this country.
And we haven't even talked about the appointment of Kamala Harris as the running mate for Biden, which is incredible. And, we've done some other coverage of that at the Gray Zone and elsewhere, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I do want to talk really quickly about the clear strategy of the party. And, the term identity politics is thrown around a lot, and it's often abused, and I'm not necessarily saying that. Clearly, in many cases, feminism, anti-racism, these things are very important struggles, but it's so incredible. Talk about cynicism. It's so incredible to see how identity politics has been instrumentalized by these neoliberal, extremely pro-war forces, not just in the US. We see it right now in Canada, where Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister, who was also just appointed the finance minister after being the foreign minister. I mean, she's like the minister of everything. And this is an extreme war hawk, neoconservative, who is the granddaughter of a Ukrainian Nazi. And I'm not holding her grandpa's crimes against her, but she also totally hid that. And when it was exposed, she called it Russian propaganda. But anyway, she's in Canada right now saying that they have a feminist foreign policy, which is insane, because Canada is arming Saudi Arabia as it kills Yemenis in the Shia. I mean, so we see in Canada this imperialist woke feminism, and then we see in the US this carceral fake woke feminism, where Kamala Harris, who called herself California's top cop, is now the vice president. And we're being told, including by people on the left who have a history of being on the radical left, who are telling us that this is a positive sign. This Kamala Harris is someone who, she went out of her way to put more people in prison, to put people in prison for smoking marijuana, to try to put parents in prison because their children were missing school. And now she's portraying herself as a progressive social justice warrior, who she goes on TV and says Black Lives Matter after throwing how many poor Black people in prison. I mean, it's so cynical just to see how, and she's running with Joe Biden, a candidate who is the opposite of like this kind of woke imperialist, like bourgeois feminist, identity politics liberal. So we have the worst of both worlds. We have like the lean in Sheryl Sandberg, imperialist, capitalist feminists, with the old school blue dog Democrats who were friends with segregationists. It's absolutely insane. And it's so incredible seeing the same people who have weaponized identity politics at every level in the most neoliberal form to attack the left. They're all saying vote for Joe Biden. It's incredible how the Democratic Party not only has embraced that contradiction, but they're not even talking about it at all. There's no discussion of that in mainstream respectable liberal circles.
Well, look, not to get into the debate that Ben talked about avoiding, but again, I would rather be resisting these people and exposing these people's crimes than exposing the crimes of Mike Pompeo, just based on what I think is a reasonable prediction of who will cause more suffering and death, and who will be easier to possibly push into doing less, into causing less suffering and death. I do think that it would be a very weak president in Joe Biden and a phony vice president in Kamala Harris versus a far-right administration that doesn't even have to pretend to pay attention to the left. And it won't be swayed no matter what people do. So look, it's like, it's heartbreaking that these are our choices. It's a huge indictment of the system. But, I've already said, and I've said elsewhere just where I stand on this, that I don't think it, I don't think it should even occupy very much time about what happens on election day. I do personally hope for the less worse outcome And then, but then our work, of course, always continues.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think, the hysteria of the Trump era among liberals is something that, I can do without. And I can't even imagine the fever pitch it's going to reach for a second term. And obviously, I can't imagine what damage a Trump administration will do. They haven't yet started a conventional war, but they've definitely tried with Iran. They're pushing on China's frontiers. The question is whether a Biden administration would continue to do that. But on the bright side, I mean, you're right. The illusions of the Obama era will be over. Biden will not be able to shield himself behind this glossy sheen of being, having a historic presidency, or even being remotely charismatic. I mean, you listen to him talk and you see him up there, and it's just it's hard to watch. And I think there's a bright side to whatever dementia he's suffering from as well, which is that it's softened his authoritarianism, his authoritarian streak that he displayed earlier in his career when he was just a hardline, tough-on-crime, right-wing Democrat who was one of the authors of the new Jim Crow that Kamala Harris later went on to enforce. So I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, and look, I want to say, too, there was some hope amongst the, whatever you want to call it, the populist, anti-war right, like libertarian right, and some elements of the left that Trump would be less hawkish based on the stuff he was saying on the campaign trail. And you know what? Maybe at the time that was a reasonable expectation based on the alternative, which was Hillary Clinton, a career warmonger. But look at what happened. No matter what Trump's actual aims are or beliefs are, to the extent he has any, he's been totally boxed in by the neocons, and he's done everything that they ask for on pretty much every single issue. Israel, Iran, Venezuela. And I don't doubt that a Biden administration will continue a lot of these policies. I'm just saying that I'd rather be resisting them and trying to get them to change their policies than trying to resist a far-right Trump administration that doesn't pay any attention to the left and doesn't even have to, because his official opposition actually goes along with so much of what he does when it comes to regime change.
Definitely. I mean, I think a first Biden term will be a lot like Obama's second term, when Obama began to face left-wing dissent and domestic resistance. Occupy was really at the end of his first term, but it flowed into Ferguson and what became Black Lives Matter. That's going to just, I don't think there'll be a respite in Biden's first term. And, what we've witnessed, what I said when I went on, one of my 2 Tucker Carlson appearances, when I went on, because it's the only place with a national audience where you could talk about Russiagate, which I guess we'll get into at some point soon, was that, this is going to blow back on the left, on the real left, on the principled left. And I think the Trump era has been horrible for that part of the left that exists outside the Democratic Party. When a Democratic administration builds up all of these expectations and fails to fulfill it, that's when people start listening more to the left. So I mean, that's kind of been the historical pattern. That's when social movements start to emerge that can kind of grow. That's been the historical pattern, at least throughout my life, but it's not much of an argument for Biden Harris. And kind of continuing on my theme of the 3 parties or 3 sort of political wings in the country, you have the far right that Trump represents, where they get elected with disproportionate white male turnout. They reflect an authoritarian, sadomasochistic mentality. They're all about owning the libs. That's their sort of new culture war theme. That's their leitmotif. And there is an element of populism there that has been completely kind of crushed at the end of the first Trump term, which then there probably won't be a second term. And I talked about the left, the left party that's unrepresented in the Democratic Party, and then you have this, coherence, this congealing of the establishment right and the establishment center left or center, which is now represented by Biden and Harris. And I think in that party, which is not ascendant, it's just what's there, Biden really is just a placeholder. I don't even know if he'll last through his first term, Kamala Harris is someone, Kamala Harris, I'm not allowed to say Kamala. Kamala Harris is someone they chose really because she was the closest thing to Obama that they could get. And you can understand the outward-facing marketing strategy of this establishment party that wants to rule the empire in perpetuity by looking at Kamala Harris's Twitter bio. And it says, I don't have it in front of me, but there's just some shit there that stands out to me where she says her gender pronoun. Only Elizabeth Warren said that during the primary, but she's put her gender pronoun on there.
I have up her bio here. I'll read it really quickly. So for those watching on YouTube or listening, U.S. Senator and Democratic candidate for Vice President of the United States, wife, Mamala, we'll get to that in a second, auntie, fighting for the people, she/her. So there's a few things here to address. First of all, Mamala, fighting for the people, and then she/her.
So, well, first of all, Mamala, when we, my extended family would get together. I only have a brother in my nuclear family, but my girl cousin, when, my grandfather would greet her, he'd be like, tatala, it's a Yiddish term, Mamala. It's kind of got a Yiddish flavor to it. And actually the Jewish Daily Forward, which has become like this liberal Zionist trash can, but was traditionally the oldest Yiddish socialist publication, has celebrated, I'll try to pull that up here, Kamala Harris calling herself Mamala. It's, it's just completely ridiculous, but I think it is kind of like a tip of the hat to liberal Jews. Hold on. How do you spell it? Mamala?
Yeah, I have it up here, Max. This is the Jewish Daily Forward. Kamala Harris's Yiddish nickname shows how close she is with her Jewish family. People should keep in mind here that this same outlet published an article, the Forward published an article claiming that Kamala Harris's husband is like a hot Jewish dad or something.
Yeah. Kamala Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, is our hot Jewish dad crush, which makes me, Max, want to push back on your claim that the Ford has become a trash can. I mean, this is solid stuff right here. This is good. This is good journalism.
This is like, their expose of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in the Lower East Side. It's powerful journalism.
Here it is up. Kamala Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, is our hot Jewish dad crush. I got to say, I mean, Jewish dads are cool, but he is not hot in any way. That is absolutely an insane description.
Well, I'm unable to judge the attractiveness of men. I'm sorry. But
first time though, Moderate Rebels has made a judgment on whether someone's hot or not. This was
a historic first.
Exclusive. Yeah, all right.
So it's very Obama-esque though. Remember when Obama, he went to like some synagogue and he's like, "Look, my name Barack is actually Baruch. It means blessed in Hebrew. So I'm just like you, and I'm not scary like Jesse Jackson or Stokely Carmichael. I'm gonna go tell black people to pull up their pants. There's all this tension." And I'm going to relieve the tension, but it's that, and it's also identity politics, and the gender pronoun is more, it's the new identity politics thing you have to do. And then you have this raft of articles celebrating Kamala Harris by people like Jennifer Rubin, who's like attached herself to the resistance and been accepted after just like a few years ago. She was going on like tours of illegal Israeli extremist settlements by the Emergency Commission for Israel. I mean, she was just like a straight up Likudnik neocon. And now she's hailing Kamala Harris as a Truman Democrat who advances a muscular foreign policy. Muscular is code for bombing lots of brown people. It's like
they love that phrase, muscular foreign policy.
Muscular.
So funny.
Neocons who have no muscles and like have these soft hands, and they're like Bill Kristol talks like, I shouldn't impersonate, but have you heard Bill Kristol talk? He's not a muscular guy. Okay. I'm not saying I'm like the ultimate like macho dude or whatever, but like, come on, these aren't muscular people. It's basically about sending, American boys and girls from like Spokane, Washington and Scranton, PA to bomb lots of brown people. And Truman Democrats, why don't we call them Hiroshima Democrats? this is what they think Kamala Harris is going to be. So if you look at the writing of her and how she's presenting herself, it is the future president of the establishment party, and John Kasich, Susan Molinari, Cindy McCain, Colin Powell, all these Republicans are on board for it because they don't want that far right wing to get back into power. So they've created this new coalition. It's all about managing a declining empire and preventing the people who think like AOC is the future of the party from completely abandoning the Democratic Party. So that's what I see in Harris. I think she's the insidious figure. Biden is sort of, harmless and is just like a placeholder.
Yeah, I mean, he physically is incapable of governing. Even if he wanted to, he is just, I mean, that guy is totally demented. His brain is Swiss cheese. He can't even give a speech. He's reading from a teleprompter and still can't give a speech. So, I mean, he's clearly just there because he's the vice president for Obama, and he can maybe get elected. Although we had a discussion about this. Max is more confident. I'm actually not confident that Biden will win. I still think the chances more likely that Trump will win. But even if Biden does manage to win, it's clear that he's not going to govern. The technocrats around him, who are Atlantic Council and Brookings Institution vampires, they're going to be the people who actually govern the country.
I want to mention Tulsi Gabbard for a second, because what happened to her, I think, is very instructive in terms of understanding where the party is at. So in the 1980s, as Max has mentioned, you have Jesse Jackson, who not only has a progressive agenda at home, but he's calling for Palestinian rights. He is opposing the dirty wars in Central America. He's speaking out against imperialism. And look what happened to him. He was basically thrown under the bus by the party. Everybody was trashing him. They sort of groomed Obama as the kinder Jesse Jackson to replace him. And then fast forward to these primaries, the 2020, 2019 primaries. And Tulsi Gabbard is the first major candidate since, I guess, Mike Gravel, who is speaking out against imperialism, against regime change, proxy wars. And look what they did to her. I mean, it's insane. Like this, bipartisan campaign basically to destroy her, call her a Russian asset, an apologist for dictators and all that. And despite the fact that it was also, there was sexism and even some racism involved, the fact that, there was no place for her in the identity politics discussion. She was just relegated to a corner and deemed to be an apologist for dictators because she dared to criticize U.S. foreign policy abroad. And the result now is a Democratic convention where it's considered okay for war criminal Colin Powell to get a speaking slot.
Tulsi Gabbard was, I think, the first indigenous candidate for president, first one I can think of. She won more delegates than Kamala Harris, and she was not invited to the convention. She was never even mentioned when she remained in the race, but the other female candidates would drop out. MSNBC anchors would say, there are no female candidates left. It's just like she didn't exist. And in the end, she attempted, correct me if I'm wrong, she attempted to endorse Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders' campaign rejected her endorsement.
Yeah, I believe there was a report that she had reached out about endorsing, but either never heard back or was explicitly rejected. I think her brother-in-law said something to complain about how the Bernie Sanders campaign treated her.
So she endorsed Biden just to kind of say, screw you to Hillary Clinton, who had called her a Russian asset, who was going to run third party to divide the party or divide the country and divide the electorate, and screw you to the Bernie campaign, because she came from the Sanders Institute or Bernie for America, and was rejected. She certainly was the target of a disinformation campaign by hardcore pro-Bernie influencers on social media. I mean, that's undeniable. But it does show you that there's no place in the party for someone like her, who honestly, if the party had decided to build her up, if it hadn't spun out this disinformation campaign, if she wasn't attacked at every turn in the opinion pages of the Washington Post by neocon chicken hawks like Josh Rogan, if she wasn't defamed by Hillary Clinton. She's someone who I think actually would have been a vice presidential candidate who would have eaten into Trump's base. Whereas Kamala Harris's nomination gave Trump a bump. As soon as she was nominated, Donald Trump went up in the polls and closed in on Biden. He halved Joe Biden's lead. So I think, the Democrats, it's not about an electoral strategy as much as an ideological choice that they're making.
Yeah, because the president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. empire. And in the case of Biden, I mean, the vice president is probably going to end up being, if not the real president, at least they're going to have a much more outsized impact than the current vice president or past vice presidents. And on that note, I think we should talk more about Russiagate because, part of the subtext of all of this, we've seen with the DNC, the attacks on anyone who criticizes the Democratic Party, this weaponization of the idea that you're a Russian asset. And this week, so again, today is the 19th of August, this week, the Senate Intelligence Committee just released a new report on Russiagate warning of potential Russian meddling in the election. And it's hilarious because the Democrats are once again, the Democratic Party leadership is warning that Moscow is trying to steal our election. And then now we actually have seen some Republicans say China and Iran are trying to get Biden elected. So, one of the most American of all pastimes in politics is blaming foreign boogeymen for any of your domestic problems. And we see both parties doing it. But, we have Aaron here, and Aaron has been reading through the report and looking at some of the other insane things they've been trying to do, portraying WikiLeaks as a Russian asset. So, Aaron, what's your kind of elevator speech summary of the Senate Intelligence Committee report? We'll start at the larger level, then we'll kind of get into the more granular details about it.
So I haven't finished reading the report because it's 1,000 pages, but I've gone through certain sections. The attack on WikiLeaks is really interesting, and it speaks to how, although Russiagate was in some ways very, very partisan, and it was used by Democrats to stifle Trump's presidency and even prematurely try to end it, there are strong areas of bipartisan convergence. And one area is, well, two areas really, in terms of there's been bipartisan convergence around trying to basically blunt and stigmatize Trump's 2016 calls for better relations with Russia and scaling back foreign wars. I'm not saying that those calls were sincere, but those were the that was the message Trump was giving. And I think no matter what Trump's motives were, what was dangerous to leaders of both parties was that his message was appealing. It actually caught on. It actually won him votes, especially in key states. So there's been an effort to undermine that. And there's also been a bipartisan effort to destroy WikiLeaks. Mike Pompeo gave that speech that Max has written about where he called WikiLeaks a hostile, non-state intelligence organization.
He cited The Intercept, too.
He cited, yes, congratulations to Sam Biddle for having your work.
Unlike Bellingcat, which is a friendly non-state intelligence organization.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, but by the way, for people who aren't as plugged in on the internet, quick note. I mean, people who probably know what Bellingcat is. This is like a U.S. government-funded, like hawkish pro-NATO website that purports to do investigative journalism. But what's hilarious is they stole WikiLeaks' slogan. WikiLeaks described itself like 10 years ago as an intelligence agency for the people. And Bellingcat is now publishing this book, which is just like more Russiagate propaganda. And they originally subtitled it The Intelligence Agency of the People. Although in response to backlash, it looks like they changed the name. But I mean, talk about incredible. I mean, these are the people in the CIA and Pentagon, maybe. Yeah, from the same people who Brussels. These are the people who are right now trying to crucify Julian Assange, and they're stealing his slogans. I mean, it's absolutely insane. They're so shameless. But back to the Senate report. I mean, Aaron, you were saying it's heavily focused on reinforcing the U.S. indictment of Julian Assange.
Yes. So, so you had Mike Pompeo making that declaration about WikiLeaks. It's a hostile, non-state intelligence organization, and none other than Robert Mueller, the symbol of the resistance for most of Trump's first term. He endorsed that point of view when he was asked about it when he testified a year ago in July 2019. So there's been this bipartisan convergence around undermining talk of engaging with Russia constructively and of undermining and destroying WikiLeaks. And you see that on display in this report, where the report basically says, it basically portrays WikiLeaks as an asset of Russian intelligence. It says that WikiLeaks even likely knew that in 2016, when it was releasing stolen emails, it was working with Russian intelligence. Now, of course, there's redactions, so we can't see all their evidence. But if you look at the language, it's the same old thing with Russiagate, where they're able to suggest a damning conclusion with innuendo by using qualified language like suggest or appear to be. It's all these weaselly words to, impart the reader with a conclusion without actually having to show any evidence for it. And there's a sleazy attempt to do that with WikiLeaks, and a lot of focus. And it's interesting that it's totally endorsed in a bipartisan faction, and it even repeats so many errors that have already been debunked. So, for example, in this effort to show WikiLeaks' supposed ties to Russia, there's a line in there where it talks about WikiLeaks possibly giving advance knowledge to RT about its releases, which was a claim that made waves for a second about a year or so ago. But that got debunked when it was just shown that RT happened to be on the WikiLeaks website when a certain release was published, and then RT tweeted about it. And then only after that did WikiLeaks get around to tweeting about it itself.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So
RT was being attacked for doing journalism.
Essentially. And so this report then includes that RT doing journalism as an example of why WikiLeaks might be secretly working with Russia. And observe the reaction. Because we've been told that Trump secretly colluded with Russia, that was the explanation for his victory in 2016, and that proving that was going to undo the Trump nightmare. So many liberals and progressives have bought onto this and bought onto all the attendant chauvinism that Russiagate has brought. And you see that now, where you have this report being put out that, again, continues the bipartisan assault on WikiLeaks. And there's no pushback at all. People are embracing it. And even some people, a lot of people actually, who embrace the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory are claiming vindication because this report pretends to make some new damning revelations. So it's just striking to see, again, how bipartisan some elements of Russiagate are, even though, it's framed as this Republican versus Democrat battle, and how so many liberals and progressives keep getting enlisted into going along.
Well, the one of the sort of talking points that you had to answer on Twitter was that, oh, well, these are Republicans, Aaron. Why would they do this if it weren't true? And the people who are making that, spouting that rhetoric, are people who wanted to believe this conspiracy for the last 3 or 4 years, for the last 4 years. And they've been trying to arrive at a preordained conclusion, and they thought that Mueller would give them what they wanted, and they could have this gigantic ejaculatory McCarthyite release with old man Mueller, and it never happened. He didn't give it to them. And so now this is kind of, I think, one part of this is giving that Beltway class and that corporate media element at least something to cover their asses with. I mean, you were going at Franklin Foer, who was one of the first people to introduce the collusion narrative about Trump. And he wrote a piece for The Atlantic, I think it was today or yesterday. And when he tweeted out, he said, Russiagate is not a hoax. Like, if you have to say that in 2020 after 4 years of pushing this, then you've done something very wrong. And indeed he has. I mean, he had to issue a gigantic correction when he claimed that Trump was, receiving payments through an Alpha Bank server.
Well, no, the funny thing is, I mean, he should have had to issue a correction, and he had to issue he issued a very, I think he issued an update, perhaps a very Weasley update. But what the claim was, and this was one of the earliest entries into the Russiagate fan fiction canon, where he claimed that Trump was secretly communicating with Russia through the Alpha Bank server, and Alpha Bank is a Russian bank, and that they were using this server to send secret messages to each other. That was the speculation. And you go into this, and like the source of it turns out to be a group of people who describe themselves, I'm quoting directly, quote, the guardians of the internet. And it's this group of people, I don't know, they're computer people who go around, and they somehow notice some activity where a server used by a Trump marketing company was like pinging a server used by a Russian bank. And that's how they came up with this meta theory about how this was how Trump and Russia were secretly colluding. And it was taken seriously. It was talked about constantly on cable news. Dexter Filkins of The New Yorker then did a follow-up piece a couple of years later after Franklin Foer, basically trying to advance the story. And it turns out that the idea for this came from a Democratic operative who then gave the idea to Christopher Steele, who put that in his totally vindicated dossier. But yet Franklin Foer, despite, and when I say vindicated, of course, I'm being sarcastic, but Franklin Foer, yeah, is someone who can still write this stuff. And he tweeted today, collusion was a thing.
Yeah.
Collusion was a thing. And yes, and his article is called Russiagate was not a hoax. And yeah, I mean, yeah, that's just an example.
By this point, he shouldn't have to say that. And then, you know, the other issue was the timing. You know, remember Mueller dropped his indictment of, what was it? The GRU officers who supposedly hacked into the DNC server on the afternoon of the Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki. Yep. So the timing is everything here. This was the second night of the Democratic convention, when the national security figures, basically they're going to have the war criminal segment with Powell and McCain and bring up Russiagate. Russia wasn't mentioned on the first night. So it really felt like it was time for that, but it was released under the auspices of Richard Burr, who is a conservative Republican from North Carolina, with Mark Warner, the Democrat co-chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, signing off. I feel like there's something significant about the fact that Richard Burr should be in prison right now for insider trading because he was briefed by the so-called intelligence community prior to the pandemic or during the pandemic, but before it was acknowledged as a thing in the US. And then he dumped all his stocks along with Kelly Loeffler and a lot of other figures in the Senate on the intelligence committee. They got a briefing. We're like, holy shit, the stock market's going to go down. Let's dump and then we'll pump it back in when it goes up. That's illegal. It's a straight up crime. And it's been totally forgotten and it's gone down the memory hole. And I saw all of these resistance liberals saying, wow, well, Richard Burr is really a man of principle for issuing this report. So I feel like he's a deeply compromised figure. And then you have like the other Republicans on the Intelligence Committee, including Rubio, who's like an establishment neocon, dissenting on the issue of collusion. So I think that's an issue there, that Burr is so compromised, as well as the timing of it.
Yeah, and the timing also includes the fact that it comes out right as the Durham investigation, the review into the origins of the Russian investigation is going. And they just made their first indictment of an FBI officer, Kevin Kleinsmith, who basically falsified a document to get a surveillance warrant on former Trump campaign volunteer Carter Page. And yeah, the idea that these militaristic, hawkish Republicans are going to sign off on a report that is actually critical and actually really scrutinize the conduct of the CIA and the FBI in this is farcical. They will criticize them on narrow grounds, so they'll criticize them for relying on the Steele dossier, but that's low-hanging fruit. The Steele dossier is, it's a farce, and that is also partisan. It was paid for by the Clinton campaign. So yeah, of course, Republicans are going to diverge in some ways, but when it comes to the overall geopolitical imperatives behind Russiagate, encouraging confrontation with Russia, venerating national security state officials, encouraging hawkishness, chauvinism, attacking WikiLeaks, and anybody who dissents from the dominant narratives. Both parties are going to converge there. And that's why this report is being hailed, because it's seen as this bipartisan victory, when really it's just it's a continuation of a militaristic consensus. And you see that so many examples in the report where basically, they accuse this guy, Konstantin Kilimnik, who worked with Paul Manafort. They accuse him of being a Russian intelligence officer. Now, it's notable that Robert Mueller did not do that. Robert Mueller said that Kilimnik had these vague ties to Russian intelligence, which he didn't really specify. He laid out a bunch of evidence for why he thinks that, which was not very convincing. But one of the examples that the bipartisan Senate report gives about Kilimnik to try to prove why he's a Russian intelligence officer is they point to examples where they say that behind the scenes to people, he emailed articles that were sympathetic to the Russian narrative. And they say that they've identified a Twitter account that he has under a pseudonym, where he also retweeted people who were critical of U.S. foreign policy or were supportive of what they call the Russian narrative on the Maidan protests in Ukraine and other related matters. So that to them is deemed to be possible pieces of evidence for someone being a Russian intelligence officer. And it speaks to how this is not really something about, it's not about whether there's collusion or not. This is also about enforcing a narrative. And the narrative that has to be enforced by both parties is that Russia is an enemy, and that anybody who dissents from the bipartisan foreign policy consensus of hawkishness must be some sort of Russian dupe.
Well, when we say bipartisan foreign policy consensus, and we see these documents or reports rolled out by the Senate Intelligence Committee in order to reinforce that narrative, who's behind the Senate Intelligence Committee? The CIA has officers who are actual participants in the day-to-day business of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who are giving briefings, and they're also delivering NSA, material as well. But the CIA has dedicated officers. The CIA and the so-called intelligence community, which is, I always say, is neither communal nor particularly intelligent, has been more than ever in my lifetime for the past 4 years using the Senate Intelligence Committee, using Congress as a whole, using corporate media, and using what we just broadly refer to as the bipartisan foreign policy consensus as an instrument of domestic political manipulation. And that's why it's so troubling. Although I do not want Trump to win in any way, I think he's a terrible president. It's very troubling when you see these carefully timed intelligence dumps that are designed to manipulate domestic political opinion during a political convention. It's why it's so troubling when figures like Stefan Halper are actually outed as CIA or FBI assets who are embedded inside the campaign. When figures like George Mifsud, who are shady characters trying to entrap Joseph Mifsud, are trying to entrap members of Trump's foreign policy team, it's very troubling because we're witnessing an opaque, unelected apparatus that represents it has a very clear agenda of enforcing U.S. global hegemony and its control over all aspects of politics, basically mounting what amounts to a coup. And it's not treated like anything outside the normal order of political business. That's what I find to be one of the most troubling aspects of the whole Trump era, is that there was essentially an intelligence coup. It proceeded unchecked, and no one's willing to acknowledge it as a problem except for us and a bunch of right-wingers who I, wouldn't want to sit in a room with.
Yeah, I mean, if an investigation had been launched against Obama on the same grounds that they launched this investigation against Trump and then continued this investigation, you have this vague tip coming into the FBI about where a low-level Trump campaign volunteer, George Papadopoulos, makes a suggestion of some kind of suggestion. That's basically me quoting the predicating intelligence document that started this whole thing, that Russia might be able to help the Trump campaign in some undefined way. Didn't even mention the stolen emails that are supposedly at the heart of this whole thing. And then not only starting an investigation based on that, but then opening up other investigations of everybody else in the campaign who might be tied to Russia, especially based on the fact that some of them have said publicly favorable things about Russia or not critical things about Russia. And then continuing it using so-called intelligence that is paid for by the Clinton campaign, Trump's opponent. So if you had all these things happening against a Democrat like Obama, there would be wiretapping, and then getting a special counsel appointed, even though by this point the FBI knows that the source of the Steele dossier has told them that it's all bunk. I mean, all these different things. And by the way, meanwhile, leaking false information such as that Trump officials had high-level contacts with senior Russian intelligence officials. If you had that kind of conduct happening against an Obama campaign or a Biden campaign, there would be, there'd be massive indignation, and rightfully so. But because this happened to Trump, who nobody in the establishment likes, for good reasons and some for their own cynical reasons, they don't see him as a suitable steward of the U.S. empire, you have pretty much complacency, and then you have attendant acceptance of all these horrible things where the Democratic Party is pushed even more to the right because all this forestalls the self-reflection that should have happened after 2016. And it's pushed to the right because we're now supposed to worship the CIA and the FBI and Robert Mueller because they are our saviors. And it's pushed more to the right because now anybody who calls for cooperation with Russia, reducing tensions with Russia, must be a Russian asset. And it's everybody accepts it. Everybody accepts it except for, the small group of us that never bought into it. And it's been hugely damaging. And the question will be, I think Trump is so awful that I think you're right, Max, he'll probably lose. But if he doesn't, if he manages to win again, what will be the obvious lesson there will be that I think a party that spent 3 years talking about the last election and blaming it on Russia and offering people nothing really in terms of policy, except for more hawkishness in foreign policy, this will be the direct result. The fact that Russiagate occupied Trump's so-called resistance for pretty much his entire presidency.
Definitely. I wanted to ask you, because you brought up Konstantin Kilimnik, and this also relates to Carter Page. Kilimnik was a State Department intelligence asset who worked for 10 years in Ukraine for the International Republican Institute, which is funded by the State Department through the National Endowment for Democracy, sort of the regime change meddling machine of the U.S. It looked like he was a U.S. asset, someone who was friendly to the U.S. And Mueller, as you mentioned in his report, it wasn't really his report, but the report he signed off on, did not name him as a Russian intelligence asset, and now they've done that. What's going on here? Why would they attack someone who clearly was their guy, who is doing the U.S.'s work in Ukraine? Are they that desperate? Is it that cynical, or is there something else going on there in your view?
I think it's a combination of desperation and a certain, geopolitical imperative. So first of all, the reason Kilimnik is important is because he came along as an important figure relatively late in the Mueller probe. In early 2019, all of a sudden, the Mueller team came out with this theory in court that because Paul Manafort had shared some polling data with Kilimnik, who he was working with in Ukraine, that they were suggesting that that was at the core of what they were investigating and that they have a theory about it. And the theory was that Manafort had shared his Trump polling data during the campaign with Kilimnik, and then Kilimnik had gone and shared that with Russian oligarchs, and then Russian oligarchs had shared that with Vladimir Putin, and then Putin had shared that with the Internet Research Intelligence Agency, the Troll Farm, and they had used that for sophisticated micro-targeting their social media ads at the swing states. That literally was the media narrative that we got. And I think we got it because we were at a point in the Mueller probe when there was just nothing there. And this is what they came up with. But look, even if Kilimnik is a Russian intelligence officer, and even if he did somehow pass this polling data, by the way, which was mostly public to the Kremlin, it's still a farce because the notion that the Internet Research Agency used sophisticated micro-targeting at battleground states is a joke. First of all, they didn't. They barely ran ads in the battleground states. And if they did, most of them had nothing to do with the election. We've all seen the ads, you know, the ads with like Yosemite Sam cartoons and a Jesus masturbation help hotline, where there's a picture of Jesus consoling a young man and says that if you're having problems with masturbation, reach out to Jesus and we'll beat it together. And there was an attempt to, in a Senate report, to portray this as an example of Russian asset recruitment, that the Russians were trying to exploit vulnerable Americans with masturbation problems to recruit assets. But I mean, you know, it's ridiculous on the face of it, even if the other underlying facts or underlying claims are true, which I don't think they are. So what I think is going on here is an attempt to sort of validate that narrative. And also Kilimnik, what he was doing behind the scenes was he was discussing with Manafort a peace plan for Ukraine. And even after Manafort got kicked off of the campaign because of some leaked information from Ukraine about him and his financial dealings with the Ukrainian government, which, by the way, Manafort says was a forgery aimed at basically undermining him and tainting the Trump campaign. So Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election, but that's another story.
By Lyshenko, who was, you know, someone who was very close to the Ukrainian government. That the fact is that government did interfere.
Yeah. But
okay, but back to Manafort. I mean, this is also relevant and was always left out of all the talk about Manafort, and I felt like it was the most relevant point. I don't know what he was contracted under by the Party of Regions, but it was something like Engage Europe or Engage Ukraine or Turn West. Basically, what he wanted to do was bring Ukraine into the European Economic Association Agreement and make Ukraine more oriented to the EU. And Manafort's involvement in Kiev caused a scandal in Moscow. They were upset in Moscow at the time about Manafort being involved there. So Manafort wasn't really involved in a way that pleased Russia. It was quite the opposite. And this is always left out as well.
It was left out because it undermined the narrative that Manafort...
It destroyed the narrative.
Was doing Russia's bidding inside Ukraine. And because he was supposedly doing Russia's bidding, that then tainted the Trump campaign and made it more likely that they were colluding with Russia, when in reality, as you point out, he was doing the opposite, as Mueller's own court documents showed, because Mueller released a bunch of internal communications between Manafort and Yanukovych and his other Ukrainian clients, and they all show him coming up with that strategy you're talking about, where Manafort was trying to encourage them to integrate with the West. But Kilimnik, meanwhile, his associate, was trying to push a peace plan. And this peace plan is described very bitterly in the Senate report as being favorable to Russia, when really what it was trying to do was end the proxy war in Ukraine, in the Donbass, that the U.S. and its allies effectively started when they overthrew the Yanukovych government and then undermined talks at a resolution and then kicked off this fight, which is still ongoing. So I suspect, I have no proof of this, but I suspect the fact that Kilimnik was trying to work this behind the scenes. He was trying to even bring it to the attention of the incoming Trump administration, even after Manafort was off the scene, after he left the campaign. I suspect that is part of why the Senate now is motivated to label him a Russian intelligence officer, coupled with the fact that there is an imperative to just lend some credence to this investigation and to the FBI's attempts to come up with something. Because it was so ridiculous. The impact of labeling him a Russian intelligence officer is, I think, to blunt any future efforts at talking to people who might be advocating peace with Russia, as opposed to the proxy wars that the Senate Intelligence Committee favors.
Absolutely. And you know, we got years of this, you know, just years and years of kind of hostile Russiagate hoaxing, and all we're left with is this new Cold War, which will continue regardless of who wins in November.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear about Kilimnik. You know, Mueller made this vague contention that he has ties to Russian intelligence. The list of it is complete. It's very weak. It's very vague. The Senate appears to have uncovered no additional evidence, and what they're doing here is making their own assessment. And it's interesting. Everybody is just taking it on faith without looking at the actual evidence that they show. A lot of it is redacted, but a lot of it is based on, again, Kalimnik's supposed views and his efforts to promote a peace plan with Russia. And that's deemed to be evidence of him being a Russian intelligence officer, which is farcical on its face. And
the Twitter account, which is said to be him, which denied being Kalimnik in its correspondence with you.
Yeah, I asked him. He said he wasn't. But again, until I actually, until I get him on video and talk to him, that doesn't mean anything, or it doesn't mean much. But yes, this Twitter account that the report says is his does deny that he is Konstantin Kalimnik.
And the evidence isn't provided, which raises certain questions. For example, did the FBI go to Twitter and demand to know which account was matched with certain information attached to Kalimnik, like his phone number?
Yeah, they did. Yeah. There's a reference to getting information from Twitter, and maybe it's true. Maybe it is this guy's Twitter account, but in terms of evidence, they don't show it. And certainly the evidence for him being a Russian intelligence officer is, to our eyes, non-existent.
Well, anyone if you're on Twitter, your DMs are available to the FBI. Your identity is available to the FBI. I mean, that's what this demonstrates clearly.
Yeah.
Those DMs belong to Twitter and, by extension, the national security state. But beyond that, the Senate report lists tweets that are sort of indictments. They're listed as indictments of Kalimnik and his political views, including attacking Bellingcat over MH17. This, for some reason, was highlighted.
Yeah, exactly.
This clearly proves that he's an intelligence asset. I mean, because he believes that. I mean, no one else would believe that.
Yeah.
That's kind of the implication.
Yeah, and he questioned the story of what happened with the massacre in Maidan, where snipers killed protesters. There's been a lot of debunking of the prevailing claims that was the Yanukovych government. We don't have to get into that. But the fact that he even questioned the narrative is deemed to be proof that he's an intelligence officer, and that's what Russiagate is. That's why Tulsi Gabbard was also smeared as a Russian asset, not based on any.
Well, we were smeared as a result of the fact that he followed our accounts, whoever it is.
Yeah,
and these sort of neocon accounts were just using that as sort of evidence that we too were Russian intelligence agents because he followed us or retweeted things. I don't know if he retweeted anything I said but he retweeted other people that we know. And so that was used to implicate them. And it just shows how this whole McCarthyite narrative is used to indict anyone who diverges from the new Cold War consensus, all the way up to the occupant of the White House and what he did in his 2016 campaign.
All right, so, here we're going to end part one of our interview with Aaron. In part two, definitely join us. We're going to talk about growing censorship campaigns on social media and the attacks on the gray zone over our factual reporting on China, which is part of this larger ecosystem of the new Cold War that we were talking about and all of these regime change organizations that were invested in Russiagate. A lot of them have also been jumping on board with the anti-China campaign. But before we conclude here, I don't want to rely on anyone to try to make, predictions here, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there is a new report that came out from Real Clear Politics that shows, and Real Clear Politics, this is a right-leaning polling firm, but it shows that Biden is underperforming Clinton this time in 2016 in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which are all crucial states. So, just to wrap up here, I can't help but feel that, we talked about Kamala Harris, the selection of her as the vice president candidate really hurt Biden, at least in the polling, and helped Trump. And I can't help but feel that also reviving Russiagate, although the Senate Intelligence Committee might feel like this is something that they can use to try to hurt Trump, I actually think that in some ways it might actually be empowering Trump, because we see, according to numerous polls, CNN had a poll, it shows that the margin between Biden and Trump is getting smaller and smaller right on the eve of the election. And I can't help but feel like I felt in 2016 when, actually in 2016, we were told on the eve of the election that Hillary Clinton had a 97% chance of winning, 97% chance of winning. And we see the situation now. So I just can't help but feel like the Democrats are, even if they want to win, they're continuing to shoot themselves in the foot. And it's very hard to be optimistic.
Well, yeah. I mean, what has been the Democratic mantra for the Trump era? I mean, the words of Nancy Pelosi, all roads lead to Putin. That's literally what they've talked about, and it's their official mantra. That's what they even say, all roads lead to Putin. And so what will be the impact of that mantra and that fixation on the election? I hope it doesn't help Trump enough to make him win. But yeah, I mean, it's not hard to foresee that. I mean, when you have a party that refuses to engage in any meaningful self-reflection after losing in 2016, when a fake anti-establishment candidate wins. So one obvious direction to go in is embracing a genuine anti-establishment message to win over the people in Michigan and Wisconsin that the party lost. When that is avoided and forestalled in favor of Russiagating constantly, what is the impact? And will that impact result in an election loss? I mean, I hope it doesn't, but it's not entirely hard to fear, especially since, and this is the point I've been trying to make since the beginning of this whole thing, if you're an actual leftist and you actually care about defeating Trump, what bigger gift to him could there be than channeling your so-called resistance into a dumb conspiracy theory and the hope that Robert Mueller will validate it? And even after it fails, doubling down with Ukrainegate and all of a sudden making it about weapon sales to Ukraine and text messages amongst diplomats, all these things, putting aside the chauvinism and the warmongering that are completely divorced from people's lives, especially in the swing states that you need to win. So yeah, it's no surprise to me that this race is so tight when it really shouldn't be. I mean, Trump is a clown who's done nothing for anybody except the ultra wealthy.
Well, and we're in the middle of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and still look how close the polling is. It's insane.
Yeah, and look how bad he's
he's killing his own base.
He's killing his own base,
and
he's
killed Herman Cain.
And his handling of this pandemic has been a disaster. But yet, the polls show that this race is not over, and that it's actually close. So I think that's a stunning commentary on just how inept and corrupt the Democrats have been in their resistance. And I have my views on the election. I hope it doesn't sink them, because I'd rather have them in power than Trump. But it looks like they're doing everything they can to not be a real alternative to Trump.
Well, on that note, we're going to end part one. We were speaking with Aaron Maté, our colleague at The Gray Zone. You can check out all of our work at thegrayzone.com. And of course, this is Moderate Rebels you're listening to. Aaron has his own show called Pushback. You can check that out on YouTube. And you can also check out a podcast version. For those who listen to Moderate Rebels, you can listen to Pushback, his video show and podcast. And then finally, if you want to support this kind of journalism we're doing, unfortunately, there are not many people calling out Russiagate. It's very few people. So if you want to support the work we do, we rely on individual donors and friends and fans of ours. So please go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels and join us in part two for more talk of the new Cold War and censorship. I'm Ben Norton, and we're out.